Hello, this is the 8th part of the Chunkloading rant, and today I'm going to cover a bunch of issues to do with dimension unloading. The root cause is not necessarily in the chunkloading code, but the issue is similar enough and it influences the same processes as the issues with chunk loading do. Thus, if you want to fix chunk loading issues, you will also have to fix dimension unloading issues. So what is dimension unloading? For any given dimension, if for the past 300 game ticks the following conditions are satisfied, so there are no players, no force loaded chunks, no active ender pearls creating loading tickets, and no entities entered that dimension through any portal, then that dimension will stop ticking entities, block entities, and the dragon fight if dragon fight exists in that dimension in the first place. It is obviously an issue because you don't want your dimensions to randomly stop taking entities or block entities, because it obviously will break all of your redstone contraptions that rely on entities or block entities. But you do not usually observe it. That is because if you look closely at these conditions, you will realize that when they are satisfied, there shouldn't be any loaded chunks left in that dimension in the first place. But turns out there are 4 ways in which the chunks can stay loaded in the dimension while the dimension itself gets unloaded. So here they are. First one is with an AND gateway chunk loader. The first thing you should realize is that AND gateways only teleport entities within the same dimension. The entity never uh, goes through goes between different dimensions. Thus, these conditions, this one in particular, can still get satisfied. So, for example, I here have an AND gateway chunk loader, which I turned on, and it started loading itself. It is running fast because currently I set the tick rate to 80. Uh, Now I will get the data of that armor stand to show that the chunks stay or do not stay loaded. Let's say position. Here, as you can see, the chunk is loaded. First of all, because I am loading it. The second of all, because the chunk loader works. Now, if I fly far away, the chunk loader will continue working. You can see it in the chat. On each cycle it sends a message. And I also can get the data of the armor stand, so the chunk is clearly loaded. But if I exit the end dimension, now, in the end, there are no players, no force loaded chunks, no active pearls, and no entities go through the end portal. And now, after 300 game ticks, the end gateway chunk loader stopped working. That is because the end dimension got unloaded, it stopped processing entities, thus the boat in the end gateway chunk loader stopped ticking, thus it's no longer able to teleport, thus the chunk loader just broke. Obviously, there is an issue because you don't want your chunk loaders to randomly stop chunk loading. That kind of defeats the purpose of the chunk loaders. So yeah, let me turn it off. And yeah, the next way in which dimensional loading can influence your stuff is with ender pearls. Here it is a bit more tricky, as ender pearls themselves cause the dimension to not unload. But there is a way to make the dimension unload anyway. So here I go back to the end, because end is a convenient dimension to showcase the issues. And here I have an ender pearl stasis chamber. Now let me get the data of this armor stand to show that it is loaded or isn't loaded depending on the conditions, on the circumstances. So you'd expect that chunk with an ender pearl to not unload until at least I log off the server, and then that chunk to load back in when I log back onto the server. And it is the case if I am in the end dimension. So here, if I fly very far away, the chunk is still loaded by the ender pearl. And if I log off and then log on, even though I logged off and my ender pearl got removed, if you didn't know, ever since 1.20 something, ender pearls get removed when you log off and then get reintroduced to the world when you log back on. As you can see, that chunk is still loaded because the ender pearl got added back and it started loading the chunks again after I logged on. But this won't happen if I log off while not in the end dimension. So again, you'd expect the chunk to stay loaded, and if I go back to the overworld, it is in fact still loaded. That is because the ender pearl is actively ticking there. But if I log off and then wait for 300 game ticks, currently the tick rate is set to 80, so 300 game ticks is about 3 seconds, so it's definitely enough. Now, when I logged back on, that chunk is no longer loaded. Why is that? That is because when I logged off, the ender pearl got removed, thus there were no longer pearls in the end, and no players, and no force loaded chunks, and no entries entered the end. For 300 game ticks, thus the end dimension stopped processing entries. And there were no entries in that dimension in the first place, except the armor stand, so it didn't matter until I logged back on. When I logged back on, my ender pearl got added back to the end dimension, but it couldn't tick because the dimension was still unloaded. Thus, the pearl got placed in the end and then unloaded because it couldn't tick. It couldn't create new loading tickets. So yeah. Let me remove the inner pearl. So, another way in which dimensional loading can influence your stuff is in spawn chunks. Obviously, if you build something in your spawn chunks, and then the overworld stops processing entries or block entries, it will break all of the redstone contraptions in the spawn chunks that rely on entries or block entries. It is very simple to understand, so I didn't build any showcase setup for that. And the same goes for the dragon fight. If you didn't know, dragon fight has its own chunk loading ticket. Thus, while the dragon fight is taking place, the chunks around it are loaded. This is the single example in which it makes sense to stop processing entries, because you don't want to spend your time processing a bunch of Endermen while there aren't even any players in the end. So yeah, but the 3 previous examples are very much a problem. So yeah, that's it for the chunk loading issues part of this video, but there is also one more bonus issue. It's not to do with chunk loading, but it's also kind of interesting. So it's to do with tick freeze. You might have previously thought that tick freeze is not intrusive, in a sense that if you tick freeze your game, then none of your contraptions should break while in tick freeze, so you can unfreeze them safely. Turns out that it is not the case. Here I have a contraption. To be more specific, it's a chunk loader, which can break because of tick freeze, and it does break because of tick freeze. Here, I entered the spectator mode, so I'm no longer loading the chunks around me because the game rule spectator generates chunks false is set. Spectator generates chunks is set to false. Here now, the chunk loader is loading itself. You can see that by the armor stand briefly disappearing. That happens because the timing of the chunk loader is set up in such a way that either side of the chunk loader gets briefly loaded and then unloaded. And you'd expect the chunk loader to continue loading itself indefinitely, but that is not the case because the dimension unloading timer still ticks down even during tick freeze. So if I freeze the game at a specific moment in the chunk loader cycle, um, the dimension unloading timer will tick down while the game is frozen, and the nether dimension will stop processing entities after some time. Thus, the chunk loader will break when I unfreeze the game. Here, I unfroze the game, and as you can see, the armor stand didn't appear back. That is because the chunk loader broke during tick freeze and then never recovered back. Uh, that is a there is at least one way in which you can detect whether anyone tick froze your server in the past at least once or not, if you had that thing running for a while. Um, so yeah, that is it for this video. Uh, Thanks for watching. I hope that I will release the next one soon-ish.